A crash against the gate post brought Silas Brant out into the snow with his rifle half raised, ready for wolves or rustlers, and what he found instead dropped his heart clean into his boots. A woman lay crumpled against the frozen ground, one hand still tangled in the gate's top rail where she'd caught herself on the way down, her belly round and heavy beneath a threadbare coat entirely unfit for the blizzard howling in off the grey rock hills. Snow already dusted her dark hair white. "Ma'am." He was on his knees beside her before the word had fully left him, rifle forgotten in the drift. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered, dark with exhaustion and pain, and she managed only a few broken words before they closed again. "The baby, please." "Not out here." Silas did not waste breath on questions. He gathered her up. She weighed next to nothing despite the burden she carried, and that frightened him more than the storm did, and carried her through the snow to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them against the wind before laying her as gently as his shaking hands allowed on the bed nearest the stove. She was Ruth Callahan, he would learn once color returned to her lips, and she could speak in full sentences again. Widowed 3 months past when her husband's wagon overturned crossing the Marsh Creek ford, and turned out of the small rented room she'd been keeping in Grey Rock Town when her landlord decided a widow with no income and a baby coming was no longer a tenant worth the trouble. She had been walking the county road looking for any homestead willing to take on a hand for board, with no clear plan beyond putting one foot ahead of the other, when the blizzard caught her 3 miles from the nearest shelter, and her own strength finally gave out at his gate. Her husband, John, had been a gentle, unremarkable man, a freighter by trade, and their marriage had been a quiet, contented thing built on small kindnesses rather than grand passion. She had grieved him honestly, and still did, but the grief had long since been crowded out by the sharper, more immediate terror of facing a birth alone with no roof guaranteed to hold over her head. She had written to her sister in Ohio the week after the funeral, but no answer had come before her landlord's patience ran out, and she had told herself, setting out on that county road with everything she owned in one worn trunk, that she would simply keep walking until some door opened or her strength failed entirely. She had not expected, in her most desperate imaginings, that the door which finally opened would belong to a man willing to carry her in out of the storm and ask nothing in return. "You'll stay till the weather breaks," Silas said, when she'd finished the halting account of it, too proud by half to ask outright, but plainly too exhausted to argue. "Longer, if you've a mind to. This is a big empty house for one man, and I could use a hand with the accounts even if you can't do much else before that baby comes." "I won't be charity," Ruth said, some of her spent strength returning to her voice. "I'll cook and mend and keep your ledgers straight if you'll teach me your system. I don't ask for anything I haven't earned." "Didn't figure you would," Silas said, and something in his gruff, matter-of-fact tone eased the worry tension out of her shoulders better than any gentler reassurance might have. "Rest now. We'll sort the particulars once you're not half frozen." She slept the better part of 2 days, waking only to take broth and answer his careful, undemanding questions, and Silas found himself, in the quiet hours she slept, doing something he had not done in the 6 lonely years since his own wife had died of the fever, talking out loud to another living soul in his own kitchen. Even if she couldn't hear him, just for the comfort of a voice in the room that wasn't his own. By the time Ruth was strong enough to sit up and take proper stock of her surroundings, the blizzard had settled into a long, hard cold that showed no sign of breaking. Snow drifted waist-high against the north wall of the barn, and the road to Grey Rock buried under it entirely. She watched Silas Brant move about his small, well-kept homestead with quiet efficiency, mending harness, tending the 2 milk cows, splitting wood enough to last a week in a single grim, silent afternoon, and found herself puzzling over a man who had taken in a stranger and her unborn child without a single word of complaint or expectation. Why? She asked him one evening, when the question had built too large in her to keep silent any longer. "You don't know me, Mr. Brant. I could be anybody. I could bring you nothing but trouble before this is through." Silas considered the question a long moment, turning a piece of harness over in his rough hands before answering. "My wife lost a baby 6 years back," he said, finally quiet and even. "The winter after, the same one that took her from the fever. I promised myself if I ever had it in my power to keep a mother and child safe through a hard season, I'd not turn my back on the chance. Wasn't much choice in it, Mrs. Callahan, once I found you at my gate. Man who could walk past that and call himself decent isn't a man I'd care to be. Ruth sat for a long moment, moved more than she quite wanted to admit by the plain, unadorned honesty of it. I'm sorry, she said finally, for your wife, for your baby. So am I, Silas said, but sorrow doesn't do much good sitting idle. Better to put it to use. He glanced at her, something almost gentle working through the gruffness of his weathered face. You rest easy here as long as you need, Mrs. Callahan. That's not charity. That's just what decent people do for each other, when they've got the means. The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected, comfortable rhythm. Ruth kept his ledgers, as promised, and found her quick head for figures a genuine use to him, catching an error in his cattle count that had cost him money 3 years running without his ever noticing. She mended what wanted mending and cooked what the pantry allowed, and slowly, in the small daily proximity of shared meals and shared silence by the stove of an evening, something warmer than mere gratitude began to take root between them. Silas found himself watching for the sound of her laugh, rare as it was, and treasuring it more each time he earned one. He found himself, without quite deciding to, telling her things he had not spoken aloud to another soul since his wife's death. The particular loneliness of a house built for two and occupied by one, the ache of watching other men's children grow up in town, while his own had never had the chance to draw breath. Ruth listened without pity, which he came to understand was its own kind of gift, and offered her own grief in careful trade, her husband's steady, unremarkable kindness, the plain terror of facing this birth alone in a rented room with no one to catch the child but herself. One bitter evening near the middle of that long winter, a pack of wolves came down out of the hills after the milk cows, and Silas was out past midnight in the freezing dark, driving them off with rifle fire and a lantern held high. While Ruth stood watch at the cabin window with her heart in her throat, unable to do anything but wait and pray he'd come back whole. When he finally came stamping the snow off his boots at the door, unhurt but grim with cold, she had thrown a blanket around his shoulders and pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands before either of them had quite registered how naturally she'd moved to care for him, the way a wife might have. You were worried, Silas said. Half a question, watching her hands still trembling faintly around her own cup. Of course I was worried, Ruth said, more sharply than she intended, the fright of the last hour still raw in her. You're the only shelter I've got left in this world, Silas Brandt, and this child's only hope of a safe arrival besides. I'll not pretend indifference to whether you come back from a pack of wolves in one piece. Silas said nothing to that, but something in his face softened considerably. And from that night forward the careful distance they had both maintained, out of politeness or caution or simple uncertainty, began to close a little more each day. You won't be alone for it, Silas told her. The night her pains first started in earnest, 3 weeks before either of them had reckoned the baby was due, with the storm outside worse than any that whole hard winter had yet produced, and the road to Grey Rock and its one doctor buried under drifts no horse could cross. I promise you that much, Ruth. Whatever happens tonight, you won't face it alone. It was the first time he had used her given name, and even through the fear tightening across her belly, she heard it and held onto it like a rope thrown across dark water. The labor was long and hard, longer than either of them had braced for, the wind screaming against the cabin walls while the lantern burned low, and Silas Brandt, a man who had delivered plenty of calves and foals in his years ranching, but never once a child, knelt beside the bed with his sleeves rolled and his jaw set. Following what fragmented instructions Ruth could gasp out between pains and what plain animal sense told him besides, Ruth said somewhere deep in the worst of it, tears and sweat mingled on her face, her strength flagging in a way that frightened Silas more than the blizzard ever could. I can't, Silas, I haven't got anything left. You do, Silas said, taking her hand in both of his, steady as bedrock though his own heart hammered fit to break his ribs. You walked 3 miles through a blizzard carrying this child and didn't let it beat you. You've got plenty left, Ruth Callahan, and I'm not letting go of your hand till you've proved it to yourself same as you've already proved it to me. The wind seemed to scream louder as the night wore on, rattling the shutters and driving snow in fine hissing streams through every gap in the log walls. and more than once Silas found himself praying, plain and wordless, to whatever God still listened to a man who'd stopped attending church regular since his wife's death. That this night would not take from him a second time what he had only just begun to hope for again. He held Ruth's hand through the worst of the pains, murmured whatever steady, useless comfort came to him, and refused, even when his own arms ached and his knees went numb against the floorboards, to so much as consider leaving her side. Whatever strength his certainty lent her, it was enough. Within the hour, by the low gold light of a single lantern with the storm still howling outside the shuttered windows, Silas Brandt caught Ruth Callahan's daughter into his own two work-roughened hands, and felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed shut and grieving for 6 long years. "A girl," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide, wrapping the baby in the clean flannel Ruth had sewn for exactly this purpose and laying her, squalling and furious and entirely alive, against her mother's chest. "You've got a daughter, Ruth." Strong lungs on her too by the sound, Ruth wept, exhausted and radiant all at once, cradling the small, red-faced miracle of her against the warmth of the stove-lit room. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Silas with a depth of feeling that went far past simple gratitude. "For all of it. I don't know how I'll ever repay what you've done tonight." "You don't owe me a debt," Silas said, settling on the edge of the bed beside her, exhaustion and joy warring plainly on his weathered face. "I told you that the first night I found you at my gate, and I meant it every day since. But I'll tell you what I would ask, if you're willing to hear it, now that the worst tonight's behind us." "Ask." "Stay," Silas said simply, not as a hand earning her board, and not out of any debt for tonight. "Stay because I've come to love you, Ruth, somewhere in these past weeks of ledgers and quiet suppers and watching you grow round with a child I'd have been proud to call my own from the very start. Marry me, if you'll have me, and let this house be the home for her, and for you, that it was always meant to be for somebody." Ruth looked at him, at the man who had carried her in from a blizzard, delivered her daughter by lantern light, and asked for nothing in return but the chance to keep loving her, and found her answer waiting with no hesitation at all. "Yes," she said, tears in her eyes though her smile outshone them. "Yes, Silas, I love you too. I think I have for weeks now, if I'm honest, though I hadn't let myself say the word." He kissed her then, gentle as the lantern light itself, careful of the sleeping infant nestled between them. And outside the storm began at last to ease toward a soft and settling quiet, as though even the winter itself had decided the house at Grey Rock had endured enough hardship for one long, transformative night. They named the baby Hope, for reasons neither of them needed to explain aloud. And in the days that followed, the cabin that had stood so long and quiet under Silas's solitary care filled with the small, ordinary miracles of a household with a child in it. A cradle he built himself from seasoned pine by the stove, a line of tiny linens drying near the fire. Ruth's voice humming low over the baby in the grey light of early mornings while Silas split kindling outside, listening through the door with a smile he made no effort to hide from the hands who noticed it. Word of the birth reached Grey Rock long before the roads cleared enough for visitors, carried by a neighboring rancher who'd come to trade and left again astonished at what he'd witnessed. And by the time the circuit preacher finally made his way through in early spring, half the county had heard some version of the story. The lonely rancher, the storm, the lantern-lit night that had made a father of a man who'd long since given up hoping to be one. They married that spring in the very yard where Ruth had once collapsed against the frozen gate post, the same ground now soft with new grass and scattered wildflowers. With half of Grey Rock turning out to see the lonely rancher and the widow he'd taken in wed at last before God and their neighbors both, Hope slept through the whole ceremony in her grandmother's borrowed arms, entirely unbothered by the fuss being made over the two people who loved her most in the world. And when Silas took Ruth's hand and spoke his vows in a voice rough, with feeling he no longer troubled himself to hide, he thought of that first terrible crash against the gate post and understood it. Now, not as the worst night of a hard winter, but as the night his whole life had quietly, permanently changed for the better. Silas Brandt, who had spent 6 years believing his house too empty ever to fill again, found himself instead the head of a family raised up out of a blizzard and a stranger's desperate need, and counted every hard winter day that had led him to that gate the finest fortune of his whole life.